After 40 years attempting to bring a live-action Flash movie to life, with nearly a decade of attempts to get this current iteration off the ground, 2023 is the year The Flash was finally released. And it left theaters after only 1 month and is now expediting its home release as an NFT. Over that long history, 10 different directors have been attached to this movie. Not just various offers made to the usual call sheet. 10 directors were fully attached and announced as making their version of The Flash. Ezra Miller was cast in this movie prior to the Flash TV show airing a single episode, and that series fully concluded a 9-season run before this feature film was released. Between completing filming and its release, the lead actor had a mental breakdown and terrorized people across Hawaii, along with 100 other increasingly worrying allegations. Also in that time, Warner Bros. Merged with Discovery, and the DCEU as we knew it was fully replaced, with The Flash movie now suddenly needing to make back that lost money as well as serving as the reboot for the DC universe. This may be one of the most disastrous productions in the history of Hollywood, and even with that chaotic history, they pretty well had no choice but to hang the entirety of the DC franchise as well as the future of this merged company on the success of this movie. And instead, The Flash will go down in history as one of the largest box office bombs of all time. For real, this movie is ending its theatric run with a worse domestic total than the 2011 Green Lantern, which was kind of ironically originally meant to serve as the starting point of this DC universe. That movie did so poorly that they tried again with Man of Steel, and now the movie that's bringing it all to an end circles back around very heavily to Man of Steel. It's very fitting that a movie about time travel includes this full circle of failure. The Batgirl movie was sacrificed and burned for tax write-offs, while The Flash stands to lose more money than the studio saved from Batgirl's destruction. The fan service in this movie is through the roof, and it's still tanked harder than anyone could have imagined. It cannot be put into words what a disaster of a production and release this movie has been. It will be studied for years to come in colleges as one of the most mishandled films of all time. And the crazy thing? The movie is fine. You definitely don't need to sprint out to see it. Maybe a light walk if you want to see some multiverse insanity and the spectacle of it all. But in the mixed bag of movie qualities that have come out of the DCEU, it's very interesting to witness the straw break the camel's back in what feels like ultra slow motion. Keeping in mind that Joker and the Batman are Elseworlds properties, the DCEU has not had a profitable movie since Shazam in 2019. This universe has had 6 straight movies bomb, and it's going to be a hell of a mountain for Gunn and Safran to climb to make anyone care about their rebooted universe. Although, considering no one really saw the last few movies, it might actually be simpler than ever to just wipe that slate clean and pretend they never happened. When you make 13 films and half of them are considered failures, it's definitely time for a change. The Flash is a character I've known since I first started following comics and superheroes. He's an A-lister. Although Wally West is actually the iteration of the character I know better, primarily featured in the DC animated universe, The Flash never really had his own show I could tune into to get to know him as well as many other heroes. And it's a comic series I just never really tried out as a kid. I think the biggest turnoff was that I've never been a big fan of his kooky rogues gallery, so it's kind of fine by me that none of them are really featured in this movie. Generally, having the character finally garner some pop culture attention felt pretty exciting, debuting with the Justice League and having his own solo outing hyped up for ages. I think if this exact movie would have released about 4 years sooner, before that goodwill was lost and the multiverse concept in general had started to feel played out, I think it could have made heaps of money. Instead, it came in the wake of Multiverse of Madness, No Way Home, and the Spider-Verse, and this sloppy attempt at that concept just didn't pan out that well. And alas, the interest in this actor, character, and universe all died at once, leading us to where we are now. I had to dedicate some time to that insane history at the top of this video, but it would honestly take 20 minutes just to walk through how many times it changed hands, was rewritten, rebooted, reshot, re-edited, and everything else that turned it into the frustrating cluster we're left with today. But even so, I kinda liked it. I really don't know how to respond to the whole Ezra Miller situation. It doesn't really feel like my place to. They've been on a pretty horrific spiral for several years now, to the point their controversies section on the Wikipedia page is longer than the filmography section. All I can really say is that Hollywood has a history of chewing up and spitting out child actors, and many develop long-term mental health issues and addictions. I can't say for sure that's what's going on here, but Ezra clearly needs help of some kind, and I genuinely hope that they take the time needed to work on themselves. Presently, I'm in no rush to see more Ezra Miller movies, but maybe after some much-needed recovery and reconciliation, that will be on the table? For now, I just want to focus on this movie in an insular review box, knowing it was filmed before Ezra went completely off the deep end, meaning recasting was never really an option. But considering all these controversies and incidents, I kind of can't believe that this line made it into the final cut of the movie.
I understand that these events can be psychologically scarring. You should seek the services of a mental health professional. The Justice League is not very good at that part yet. Trust me.
Like, does the real-world context make that extra funny through some twisted irony, or is including that entirely in poor taste? I'm stumped. So with all that in mind, let's finally get rolling on the actual full review here. And fair warning, I will jump around the film fairly indiscriminately, so from here on be warned, this is all heavy spoiler territory. Despite being largely ambivalent to Ezra's portrayal of the Flash in the Justice League movie, or movies, I actually found them to be an incredibly strong lead in this movie, which is pretty damn important considering they are playing two leads here. But let's be honest, Keaton steals the show, because of course he would. That's a little unfair, as it's really an impossible standard to live up to. We'll talk much more about him later. As I said at the beginning, I don't actually know Barry Allen as a character that well, so I came in with no expectations of how he should be portrayed. And I think Ezra brought a lot of emotion, depth, and energy to the role that I really enjoyed. The character is hyper and scattered, but there is a maturity in this movie's presentation of Barry that felt missing before, which was likely done on purpose. He's a little older and a little wiser. I really enjoy the idea of Barry's mind racing as much as his body, to the point he can barely hold a conversation. We learn that this has always been a part of his personality, and his already tiny attention span is dialed up through his powers. That's thematically very smart, and makes his powers feel like more of an extension of himself. Having him interact with his own 18-year-old self, then realizing how hyper and obnoxious he can be, is kind of charming.
How old are you, like 40? Okay, you don't stop talking. It's not charming, it's abrasive and exhausting, and oh my god, I am starting to realize what people mean.
And just generally, the alternate Barry's stupid stoner giggle cracks me up.
Yeah. Abby? Powers? I've done it many times myself. You can't just start.
But it's not all about Barry being silly and exasperating. His relationship with his mother and longing to have her back is the center of this movie, and Ezra nails those scenes. The whole "I love you" exchange is cute, but that final reaction to "I loved you first" shattered me.
I loved you first.
I genuinely felt that Barry has been waiting 20 years to have that exact bit of banter with his mom. And not just in that scene. Throughout the movie, they really effectively used subtle facial tics for comedic relief as well.
Hey, I didn't know you painted. They're good.
This movie convinced me Ezra is mad talented, and it really shines in many scenes where they are actually acting alongside others. but it's very frequently just a floating head stitched onto a rubber CGI body, and the acting often gets lost trying to make that compositing work. It's very distracting. The effects throughout this movie are a whole other can of hot dogs I'll have to save for later. As a tangent on a tangent here, are the canned hot dogs in the fridge a reference to the Snyder Cut? Considering at the end of the film we have a self-insert from the director where the Flash steals a hot dog out of his hands, I have to think that both of these are funny winks and nods to that now fairly infamous sequence from the Snyder Cut. How about a brief moment of praise for the CGI? I was actually surprised how good having the two Barrys interact looks. They apparently used a combination of those LED volume screens with face replacement on a body double. There were a few brief instances where the telltale signs of a face swap were visible, and it was actually much more noticeable with Affleck's face slapped like a rubber mask onto his stunt double during that opening sequence. But in a movie filled with dodgy CGI, it worked much more often than it didn't. Having the two Barrys together worked much more often than it didn't. You'd think having two Ezra Millers on screen would be unbearable, but they did a great job of making the two portrayals feel different, and like a fairly realistic interpretation of both an immature and adult version of the same person. That interplay and growing self-awareness saved the character from annoying me throughout the way I assumed they would. That was a tough line to walk considering the character's overflowing energy levels, and I applaud Ezra and Andy for making that work. Having Barry give himself powers only to lose his own, then needing to train himself to use his own powers again was great. And no, I don't intend to rephrase that sentence to make it more clear. I think I prefer that this movie bypasses having a Flash-specific villain to instead focus on Barry fighting against himself and his own obsessive desire to regain his family. Recycling Zod means we already know his motivations, and the emphasis can instead be put on Barry, and surprisingly, that's to the movie's benefit. We know there will be consequences to this time-traveling pursuit, yet I couldn't help but root for him regardless, running back in time to try and save his mom. Having the first live-action Flash movie be a vague Flashpoint adaptation was probably overall a mistake, but that's neither here nor there. That's what we're working with, and I just kinda have to take it as it is. Considering the character had already been introduced to this universe, it was actually kind of a clever way to give us a Flash origin nested inside this larger story. We get to see how Barry behaved first testing out his powers, with his future self providing fun insight and commentary reflecting on how he did the exact same things.
Because I went through it. Speedy Gonzalez. Yes, I've done it many times myself. You can't just start.
This entire sequence is a riot. Sprinting through the streets, grinning ear to ear with a super grass needle drop, that's absolute perfection. The majority of this movie maintains a great pace and fun-loving energy that I was totally on board with. It starts to fall apart towards the end, but the first 2/3 or so really sucked me in. And moments like this are a great example. He catches on fire, causes a massive pileup, knocks out the power grid, then cutting back to future Barry witnessing this far-off catastrophe in horror.
What did you do? Nothing. Why?
Only to then instantly end up naked again, walking back into the apartment a second time with this palpable shame on his face. The combination of physical and character-driven comedy throughout earned some very real laughs from me. The imagery of Barry doing his flaily run thing at regular speed is everything it needed to be. That motion has always been riding a line of absurd, managing to somehow look very cool in slow-mo, but now underscoring the oddity of it in real time just tickled me. We come to learn that Barry was there the day Zod invaded, attempting to be a hero almost immediately after getting his powers. It's really awesome to simultaneously address where were the other heroes when the super alien attacked Earth, as that is a question the audience and comic book readers in general so often just have to dismiss, while also expanding on Barry's character character in a meaningful way. It shows he has a strong desire to help, but the hard lesson there is that you can't save everyone, which clearly haunts him. And even more than that, it establishes that current Barry has experienced an important moment of personal growth that past Barry never has. Our Barry has lived with that guilt all these years, while his younger self has the naivety to think that he can still save everyone. His presence at Zod's invasion isn't just a wink at the audience like, ooh, look, Barry was there the whole time. It's threaded into the movie in a way that builds up the world and characters and informs choices made by young Barry during the climax. So the way they weaved that into this story and Barry's backstory is magnificent. My buddy Dave tells me that Dark Flash was adapted for the 3rd season of the CW show, with him claiming that it was the best overall season, but I've never seen the show myself. So maybe I'm a fool for not immediately realizing that Barry was the one who pushed himself out of the chronosphere. I thought that was a great tease, and I was waiting a long time for them to bring it back around. And I was growing a little worried that it was just gonna be some generic time guardian or something like that. But oh man, the idea of Barry turning himself into this time villain is such a wonderfully insane paradox, and felt like a brilliant way to bring things full circle for a hero attempting to rewrite history and alter fate. Instead, now creating a loop where he's fated to do this forever. His actions not only had broad consequences on the universe, but he directly altered the path of his own life in a way that dooms him to this eternal misery. I think that's really well handled. I have to scoff that the DCEU managed to squeeze out yet another generic, clunky, gray blob CGI villain, but the concept worked really well, even if I'm not a big fan of the design. Although how they explain that evolution through him doing this thousands upon thousands of times over is pretty rad. One nitpick that I'll include while talking about the Barrys is the coloration of their Speed Force powers. Having the blue and yellow lightning was a good decision, simply to create that strong visual contrast between them. In the comics, that also carries a bunch of implications for each Barry's connection to the Speed Force and their relative powers, but it's not really addressed in the movie, so whatever, we'll put that on a shelf. My real issue here is the continuity. It's kind of odd that they made the Barry we already know change colors rather than introducing yellow with the new Barry. If they really wanted to update main Barry, I've given up on finding some consistent way to distinguish these two, then main Barry's blue powers should have been passed on to young Barry when they got struck by lightning together, having that power be transferred, then having old Barry gain yellow powers in the sequence where he regains them. It would make perfect sense because he's gaining those powers under different circumstances. It would have been so simple, I don't know why they did that. I'm guessing the director just liked the yellow powers and wanted to have those present during the opening sequence. That's the only explanation I can think of. A much larger issue I had is one that surrounds the character but is no fault of Ezra's. I did not care about Barry and Iris in the least. I honestly couldn't even tell you if there's an issue with chemistry there, as we had almost no opportunity to feel that out. When we first see them together, she appears to be exploiting their past friendship for the sake of her journalistic career. The second time they talk, she specifically says she's not there as a journalist and apologizes, but then they don't talk about anything else, they just talk about his dad's trial again. Young Barry makes it clear that this has been a long-time crush, but I'm not invested in it at all, and seemingly neither is she. At least I liked a few of the gags surrounding their interactions. Speed cleaning his apartment only for things to start popping out of closets was cartoonish, but kind of funny, especially the second time. Because, you know, as they always say, comedy comes in twos. Even a minor detail like having his tie be over his shoulder the entire scene is cute and funny. And the best part of this is when his stolen wall-phased beer just straight up explodes in his hands. It was unexpected and hilarious, and kind of makes perfect sense that all its agitated molecules would just blow up like that. It feels obvious having seen it, but I think that's a great detail. Ezra's general nervousness around Iris almost makes this work.
Iris West, do you want to dinner date me?
I'd love to.
Thank you.
But I had zero investment in their relationship, and I'm kind of bummed they didn't include some kind of meet cute or anything at all that really would have made me care. So yeah, I think that's a big miss in this movie. We've talked about the multiple Barry Allens in this movie, so it's now time to talk about the multiple Batmen.
Batman.
As if DC wasn't confusing the general audience enough by having both the Reeves Batman, Joker, and a new Brave and the Bold property all set in separate universes, they decided they should also have 3 previous Batmen in one movie, none of which are planned to be used again after this release. Kind of luckily, few enough people saw this movie that I doubt it will devalue Reeves' Batman series or cause any real confusion moving forward. And I want Battinson to stay fully in their own bubble, never crossing over anywhere else. Apparently, this Flash movie originally ended with Keaton surviving, becoming the new Batman of the DCEU, set to appear again in Batgirl and Aquaman 2. Then Batgirl was cancelled, and Affleck was brought in to instead film scenes for Aquaman 2. But now, the latest report suggests that all those scenes were scrapped and no Batman will appear in that sequel. I share all that just to remind you what an absolute cluster the production of both The Flash and these last few pre-reboot films have truly been. They've changed directions like 6 times in the last year or two, and that can really be felt throughout The Flash. After all these bombs, what are the odds Aquaman even comes within spitting distance of the box office total the original achieved? It seems like maybe the most likely one to succeed, but I'm not gonna hold my breath. I'm looking forward to talking about Batman in The Flash, not just because I love Batman, but because Andy Muschietti is set to direct the Brave and the Bold movie. And based on what we saw here, I am incredibly excited for his take on the character. Some of the action here looks more than a little rough, like Batman being dragged down a highway at 100 miles per hour, but I'm not even opposed to Batman doing completely unrealistic things like this. In fact, I think most directors aren't willing to take their Batman action far enough. I love the idea of him being a regular dude who is both rich and skilled enough to do things the average human could not.
I used my skills that I learned in the mountains.
I take no issue with Batman being an unstoppable ninja Terminator. My own complaint here boils down to how rubbery and crappy most of the Batman CGI looks. But that's a symptom of this rough production, blown budget, and obvious VFX crunch. I imagine a more polished version of this scene that has been thoroughly planned out far ahead of time could look absolutely incredible. Picture the shot of him spinning out of that fiery explosion, Keaton punching and roundhousing goons, or flipping around and one-manning this giant Kryptonian with nothing but his grapples and bombs. If the CGI were better, that would be some of the best big screen Batmaning I've ever seen. It's no wonder that Gunn was willing to hand their latest take on The Dark Knight over to Andy after seeing this. We are reintroduced to Batfleck right at the top of this movie, with him calling Barry needing some help.
I need you here now, Barry.
Holy shit! Affleck can sound like that? For that one line, he sounds so much like Kevin Conroy. I genuinely liked the idea of him having a voice distortion device built into his cowl in those previous movies. But now that I've heard him do this, I wish Affleck simply used that voice whenever he was suited up. That was perfect. Then they follow that up by giving us a gray and blue costume, which I've been dying to see done in live action again. I think the armor bits look a bit too much like dirt biking pads, but I like what they were going for overall. Throughout the scene, he's got this fun banter with Barry, sassing him all along the way, which builds really well off Justice League. These two have formed a real friendship, and Bruce has lightened up a little bit. That's really great character growth. And holy shit, that final shot of this chase launching off the bridge, then grappling the edge, all done in one shot, was exhilarating. What stood out to me even more than the action was the characterization of Bruce. The speech he gives to Barry about their shared scars forming who they are is potentially the most Bruce-like speech we've gotten from this iteration of the character.
Take it from an old guy who's made a lot of mistakes. Do want to live your past. Live your life.
It's so great to see them chisel away at the hardened, jaded Bruce Snyder began with, growing into this more caring and supportive team player Batman, much closer to the one I grew up loving. There has been a lot to like about Affleck's Batman over the years, with shining moments like this sprinkled throughout the DCEU. It's kind of a shame that we never had that standalone movie where he could have brought it all together. Unfortunately, it wasn't until his final outing with very limited screen time in another character's movie that he finally had the opportunity to explore those corners of the character. Affleck proved a long time ago that he's a solid fit for the role. But it was that sparkle of greatness here that made me really wish we could have seen more than just 2 team-up movies and some cameos during his tenure with the Cape and Cowl. Jumping ahead quite a ways here, looking at Keaton's return to the role for the first time in 31 years. Honestly, based on the way this movie was marketed after Ezra fell off, you'd assume this was a Batman film first and foremost. But I assumed they were kind of hiding behind that and he'd end up being a fairly minor role. But Keaton is basically a co-lead for a solid hour of this movie. And oh man, does he ever crush it! Should I really be surprised? Keaton is one of the most reliable actors out there, never phoning in a role and always understanding the assignment. Recreating Snyder's instantly iconic moment of Bruce throwing the Batarang at Barry, now with a frying pan, is perfectly stupid and cheeky. I enjoy that this washed-up, kooky Batman is still an incredibly agile fighter. He tells us Gotham has been safe for many years, yet he clearly hasn't lost his touch. Apparently, after the movie came out, Andy shared this Bruce retired after a full circle moment of him killing a criminal in front of their children. That's cool, I guess. But it contradicts the movie and is pointless to bring up if you're not going to actually include it. So I'm throwing that out of my own headcanon. It's so damn easy to get carried away with little winks and nods to what came before, especially when you have this major, highly anticipated return like Keaton in a movie that hangs itself so heavily on its nostalgia tripping. But there was still some restraint shown, and I enjoyed the callbacks much more often than not. The brief use of Elfman's Batman theme, watching the old Batcave boot up, and even...
Yeah. I'm Batman.
I ate those up. They're small enough to enjoy and they know to skirt right past them. But I do find that something as literal and highly specific as...
You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts.
Now that's a little forced, don't you think? That was never a catchphrase. So that's a perfect example of when things get a little clunky. But even then, it's nearly salvaged simply because Keaton is goddamn amazing. I really can't say that enough. He carries a lot of this film on his 70-year-old back. Maybe instead of Brave and the Bold, they should just bring him back as Bruce Wayne and make this universe Batman Beyond. I cannot express to you how much I want that. And just quickly as an aside, is there a more heavily referenced modern composer than Danny Elfman? I swear, I have heard stings of his Batman theme sprinkled into so many different things over the years, and it fires me up each and every time. I also love how they lean into this Batman being a little campier, with absolutely everything being Bat-themed. Like, this dude already had a gigantic bat kite laying around? Of course he does. Then we have shots like the Batwing gliding in front of the moon, or him pulling a regular measuring tape out of his utility belt with another solid callback.
How much do you weigh?
180 each plus her 440.
He really does have everything in that belt. About 100 times over, Muschietti directly shows us that he loves Batman and that he knows how to balance the camp with that badassery. Without a doubt, he fully convinced me his Brave and the Bold movie is going to be an over-the-top, fun, high-action thrill ride. Keep Reeves, the Batman, dark, depressing, and grim, and inject some of that wild Batman fun over into this series. Keeping them so stylistically separate is going to go a really long way in having audiences care about both interpretations. I do have to laugh at one specific scene because I've drawn attention to it multiple times before. What is up with the ultimate trope of hardcore badass heroics in superhero movies always being the hero smugly jumping out of the plane without a parachute? Like, half the characters in the MCU have done that at this point. Can we please finally do away with that one? Keaton gets a pass, but starting from now, I never want to see a hero jump out of a plane without a parachute again until someone finds a way to up the ante. I laughed out loud at that moment, but not for the reasons the filmmakers were intending. Now, back on topic here. Beyond the callbacks, Keaton elevates the role through a few extremely simple but meaningful inclusions. There's a shot of him sewing himself up in the mirror, taking a brief moment of joy, realizing not only does he still have it, but he actually misses it. Keaton is such an acting powerhouse that they were able to leave these moments as small and subtle as that. It's a short, wordless scene, and it's so wonderfully effective. That energy is carried straight through to his final speech in this movie.
Maybe some other time.
That's not only clever, but also very astute of Bruce. We have the world's greatest detective instantly recognizing what's happening here. The Barrys have only tried to bring him back once so far, but through that line, we can understand that he not only anticipated that, but in a brief moment of reading the telltale fear and eagerness on Barry's face, he's able to infer this isn't his first death. And I appreciate the line after even more.
We can't bring you back, can we?
You already did.
It builds so perfectly after the sewing scene and gives excellent closure for Keaton's Batman within this movie. I really thought bringing Keaton back was pointless and was just fan service that was going to entirely get in the way of everything else. Yet they not only made me care about his return, but they even made me a little sad to say goodbye to him all over again. Well done, and bring on Muschietti's Brave and the Bold. I'm ready for it. A major plot point in this film is that pretty well all members of the Justice League we know are not present in this new timeline, without Superman to stop Zod when he invaded 10 years earlier, which is coincidentally almost immediately after Barry first gets his powers. There's an interesting dynamic here, with Barry needing to get back to his own time, but he can't risk letting Zod run free, both because his mother is still alive here and because he doesn't know for sure if he'll ever make it back to the future he knows. It would be careless to leave without resolving this. They did a great job of making me invested in both Barry's personal stakes and the global threat at hand. The team learns that an extraterrestrial vessel instead landed in Russia, and upon going to break Clark out, they instead find Kara Zor-El, Supergirl, who is Superman's cousin. And yes, I know the whole Kara debate. I'm going with Kara since that's how she refers to herself in the movie.
My name is Kara.
daughter of Zor-El.
Maybe many were disappointed that they neither adapted Flashpoint with the Amazons fighting the Atlanteans, nor having Red Sun Superman. I assume that level of cherry picking was largely motivated by costs or contractual obligations. Looking at the budget of this movie, it's not like they managed to save any meaningful costs, so maybe they should have just gone all out. But I've already pushed that aside mentally, and I'm going to focus on what we were given instead. After first breaking out Kara, she starts zipping around, tossing baddies, and kicking ass in this chaotic yet somewhat stunning high-action oneer. This is one of a few sections of the movie where I'm super in favor of the heavy CGI use. For once, it mostly looks great. Mostly. The way this is filmed and lit is hyper-stylized in a way I really like, emphasizing the energy of the scene and Kara's raw power. The odd moment looks iffy, and they took some obvious shortcuts, like her prison garb being bulletproof for some reason. Fabric physics are just real hard. But then she saves Batman from a point-blank bullet to the face and throws this bad guy like a kilometer off screen. That's hardcore, and I'm totally into it. When Kara suits up for the first time later on, I think she potentially has the best supersuit in this entire movie. I love this look. While I'm on the subject, let's rip through all the different costumes here. I already talked about Batfleck. Keaton's Batman looks exactly how we know and love. No complaints there. And I think Muschietti's style actually makes the black and yellow look very striking. It just fits so well. Barry's main suit is so close to being great. The subtle texturing is solid, but it overall looks quite rubbery, and the helmet specifically looks like cheap plastic from a Halloween store. But maybe that's just because they clearly composited Ezra's face onto a CGI puppet like 90% of the time. However, when the suit lights up, it looks dope. And having it actually stashed inside his ring was awesome to see.
It was so tiny for us.
You're supposed to put it on before it hits the floor.
The repurposed Batsuit serving as a secondary Flash costume is kind of clever, even if it looks pretty wonky. But they lean into that to great effect. The hard cut to sawing the ears off, or that generally piss-poor cowl fit. Both of those moments got pretty genuine laughs from me. They're such simple slapstick gags, but I really didn't see either coming. But sitting at the top for me is this Supergirl costume. It took a lot of great notes from what Clark wore. It's left feeling sleek and powerful, while still having some nice bold coloration. This is like a 9 out of 10 for me. Maybe a belt or some sort of red underwear addition would bring it over the top, but I'm super stoked on how it looks as is. It really doesn't take long for Kara to be a super exciting addition to this movie, to then being entirely forgettable. She zooms out to the battlefield, ready to confront Zod, and her flying sequence looks excellent. I really like this. And then we get our first solid look at the flat and nothing Dragon Ball Z style barren battleground where the final third of this movie takes place. It really could not have been a more boring setting for this fight. And because it's so flat and plain, it robs these alien ships, or anything else for that matter, from having any proper feeling of scale or momentum. The way these enormous ships cast shadows looks like a PC game from 2002. That complaint aside, and mind you, it's a pretty hefty complaint, we have probably the stupidest moment in the entire movie. Zod looks up and sees Kara and does nothing, and then the movie just abruptly cuts to this conveniently timed lightning storm over at the Wayne Manor. I'm even ignoring the plot convenience of that storm because I don't really care. What I do care about is what the hell was the point of having Zod spot Kara? Neither of them do anything. She just leaves? He's there for her, and he just completely ignored her? They either should have cut that scene entirely or cut the 3 seconds where they make eye contact. What terrible, terrible editing. On their second confrontation, there is this epic shot of Zod emerging from his ship and surveying the battlefield. That is such a cool, grand introduction that is completely undone by the previous scene, which is really too bad. When the fighting begins, I was really happy to see they clearly used Snyder as the blueprint for this high-speed Kryptonian fighting. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But as with so many things over the years of the DCEU, it becomes immediately apparent how damn good Snyder is at planning and filming these effects-heavy shots. While it looks pretty good here during its brief inclusion, I think it lacks the impact and brutality he achieved 10 years ago in Man of Steel. Credit where credit is due. I do, however, love the space giant, as Barry refers to him, batting soldiers with a rocket, then throwing it at a helicopter. That's just rad. Now, we don't get to know much about Kara as a character. It's kind of a shame that we never really see her interact with anyone in any meaningful way, but there was enough that I was still excited to see Kara and Zod finally show down. But it's all over far too quickly, and once they start looping this battle over, they only show snippets of those subsequent fights, which I'd be totally okay with if they spent an extra minute on the initial matchup.
What did you do?
That was genuinely chilling. This is Kara's big moment in this film. They just spent like an entire act of this movie finding and saving her. And what do they do when the fight begins? They nearly immediately overtake the score with Batman's theme and cut away to whatever he's up to. Yeah, I love me some Batman, but that sort of jumping around in a big battle, checking in with each character only works when everyone is playing an equal role in that fight. This editing totally undermines the stakes for Kara and diminishes how important her squaring off against Zod truly is. I was actually invested in their fight, and they completely diffuse the tension by failing to give it any breathing room. That's such a genuine bummer. Then she just fully lets her guard down after baseball batting Zod a few times? Seems pretty stupid to me. Supergirl has this incredibly tragic backstory, but it all amounted to nothing, instead being killed in every eventuality. They could have made that mean something to the audience, and it's just never paid the mind it needed. And it kind of means that practically the only purpose her rescue served was to make Zod's job easier and delivering herself to him. There's a little bit of an arc in there with her returning the favor, saving Barry, helping him get his powers back. But that means the only thing she does in this movie of any real importance is help Barry, rather than doing anything for herself. I find that quite sloppy. The berries then go back to the Chrono Bowl, and she's just gone. They clearly didn't know what they wanted to do with Kara, and she feels so suddenly and completely discarded here. Like, at least Keaton got his goodbye speech, whereas Kara just fades away as a meaningless plot device. I at least found it funny when she left Barry hanging for his high five while fighting at super speed. I was starting to really like what Sasha brought to the role during her limited screen time, and would have happily seen more of her, or at least enough to give us some actual closure. Maybe Gunn liked what she did as well and she'll get to return for the Supergirl movie, but I'm kinda doubting that. So yeah, there was a lot to get excited about with her character, and that potential was pretty well entirely wasted. For anyone new to my lengthy reviews, I like to break things up with interludes that use someone from the movie at hand's cast or crew as a jumping off point to recommend other movies I like. And since Andy Muschietti's directing and future with the DC has drawn a lot of attention with this release, I figured this would be a great opportunity to praise what he can do and hopefully raise others' confidence in his ability. I'm a huge Stephen King fan, so much so that I've considered doing a series of videos where I compare his novels to their many adaptations. If anyone's curious, my favorite novel of his is Pet Sematary. The most popular of those adaptations in years, the one that really kicked off a renaissance of King adaptations, was Muschietti's two-part It adaptation. Interestingly, that series also covers two timelines, showing a group of kids, then adults, battling against a deranged demon clown who is terrorizing their small town and murdering children. Pretty tonally different from The Flash. I know a lot of people didn't like the second It movie as much, but I'm a big defender of both. There is a faithfulness to both these adaptations that I never expected to get. There's one key scene that I think everyone who read the book will be glad was left on the cutting room floor, but other than that, basically every strange and chaotic decision King put to paper, Andy found a way to bring to the big screen. The young cast was spectacular, and their aged-up counterparts were flawlessly cast. Chastain, McAvoy, and Hader all elevate this sequel, with Bill Hader especially being an inspired choice, and he completely steals the show. When these movies were being marketed, I remember them being treated as some new era of horror, something that went beyond jump scares that would haunt you for years to come. And then they came out and it turned out they were basically just a bunch of jump scares. And while that's a little disappointing, it's relatively true to the novel, and the cast and their chemistry make it work. And not only did Andy adapt the books faithfully, his directing paired with Skarsgård's work as Pennywise created like a dozen instantly iconic moments in silver screen horror. Andy's flexibility and thoughtfulness as a director, his many visual flourishes, and capturing brilliant performances all around have made him someone I plan to keep a close eye on throughout his career. If you want some fun and laughs mixed with your horror, or you're an avid King fan, set aside an evening and treat yourself to a double feature. It's a wild ride. And if you are a King fan, for the love of all that is holy, do not watch the Stand miniseries from a few years back with Ezra Miller. That's another King classic, and Ezra is insufferable as the trash can man. And no, despite the name, they are not a superhero in that movie. If you've seen any clips of that performance, it's a large part of what made me think Ezra was a bad actor and scared me off of The Flash initially. Speaking of, let's get back to the review, shall we? Looking at the full movie, I've covered all the main characters of this film in their own sections, so it's high time I start digging into some of the broader filmmaking, as well as the plot and storytelling. It's a bit ironic to move through a review about a speedster at such slow speeds, but that's just how I roll. Right at the top of this movie, we get our first look at Andy's take on Barry's super speed powers, and I thought it was breathtaking. When the street draws itself out in front of him, pausing briefly before he actually starts propelling forward, and we see Barry running through hundreds of miles of countryside across water from city to city, that's so great. I also enjoyed the fake out with the title card. That's a quality gag in my eyes.
Sorry if this sounds weird, but are you actively eating that candy bar? Maybe you could throw it to me. In the name of justice.
I'm actually fine with the cartoony look the larger world takes on while Barry is tapping into the Speed Force. Stylistically, I think it works quite well. But the shitty CGI you've likely all heard of every time anyone breathes a word about this movie almost immediately rears its ugly floating head. Look at this scene where Barry is wrapping up these electric cables. What the hell am I looking at? You couldn't just build a physical set and add electricity in post? Nope. It's almost upsetting how uncanny this all looks. When a scene looks this awful, I have to assume it was 100% reshoots? Because if that's not a consequence of crunch, what other excuse could there possibly be to cut that many corners? And the movie looks like this far more often than I care to draw attention to. Suffice to say, these rough visuals are fairly commonplace. And each time it looks like utter ass-butt garbage. So I'll save us all from 10 minutes of redundant CGI complaints. It's unforgivable to the point of nearly ruining the entire movie. And beyond all of that, what is Barry doing? Nothing about your powers makes you immune to this electricity, and you're just kind of moving them around with your body? Surely there are more pressing things you need to be dealing with right now, rather than tying knots in live wires at regular speed? No thought was put into that. Moving past that, I really gotta get off of this point here. You might not think it based on that rant, but I really like this opening sequence. The movie starts off with Barry being late for work and needing to endure this insanely slow sandwich maker. Scenes like this one are evidence that Andy is a great director when not reshooting things 6 times to meet some studio mandates. The camera work is hyperkinetic, it's moving around non-stop, paired with Barry's rapid dialogue delivery and anxious fidgeting, expertly emphasizing his impatience and putting us directly in his shoes, which then leads into some awesome high-stakes action, and it wonderfully sets the generally lighthearted tone for the rest of the movie. While we've met this Flash before, this movie was repeatedly tasked with actually introducing much of his powers and their limitations, like his high-functioning metabolism and constant need to be monitoring calories. I love when things start to speed back up mid-action and Barry needs to speed eat anything within reach to return to full slow-mo. We also learn that moving people at super speed is exceptionally hard on their bodies.
What did you do?
I had to move you, but I just did it a little.
I did not expect him to Ralph that hard. That never really mattered in past movies, Barry helped move people around all the time, but let's ignore that bit of continuity, because I prefer when a seemingly overpowered ability like this has limitations put on it. Look at Quicksilver in the Fox X-Men movies. They basically have to create excuses for him to not be present at all times, because his super speed basically turned him into a god. As much as it's been made fun of recently, I'm a strong advocate of this avalanche of babies. Dodging through Looney Tunes level hazards of flying knives, acid flasks, and flamethrowers, it's gotta be one of the most delightfully absurd opening set pieces I've ever seen. Barry sticks a baby in a microwave, piles several up on a stretcher, leapfrogging over it. I unironically love everything about this. Never in a million years did I see this coming, and I'm fully on board. And it's an actual disaster that a speedster would be well suited to solving. Then, after fully saving the day, he sprints back home, and this dude is just finishing making his sandwich, just fully talking to himself those last 5 minutes while doing so. Combine all that with the fun Batman action I talked about before, and the opening of this movie kinda rules. I was pretty bummed that Billy Crudup didn't return for this movie because he's such a talented actor. But you know what? Ron Livingston is potentially a better fit for the silly dad angle they were going for here anyways. He fits the role well enough, so the recasting is overall a non-issue. We get to learn a little bit more about Barry's past and see his family dynamic, and I think the music and visuals of Barry running through time after are excellent. The transition from him running hyper fast in real time to then running super slow in Speed Force time was really cool. I would say the soundtrack of this movie is largely forgettable, but there are a few standout moments like this that are pitch perfect. I do wish they did a little more to emphasize the emotional weight of Barry running back in time. He just sort of runs and at the very end shouts.
Why are you doing this?
I just felt like running.
Ezra is a talented actor, and I think there was a lot of room here to better show that frustration, grief, agony, and rage. We get our first look at the Chrono Bowl. It was fine when he was just running, then all at once I hate everything about how this looks. Like, they absolutely could have had these refracting images without relying on these ugly rubber clones. I believe this is the stuff Andy was trying to hand-wave away as some stylistic choice. But it just looks like shit. And after all the flack Love and Thunder got for the whole floaty head thing, the Flash managed to just fully recreate that moment here equally as terribly. Then it just hard cuts away from it all. This sequence was super cool up until the gross PlayStation 3 graphics arrived, and then everything just kinda ends. It reeks of figure it out in post, rather than actually planning what the visuals here would, could, or should be. I've already covered a lot of the second and third act, so I'll pick up the pace here a little bit moving through the movie. Barry going back in time and hanging out with himself in these Back to the Future shenanigans is probably the highlight of the film for me. This is pure, unadulterated fun. Look at the shock on the faces of this old couple after Barry swipes their clothes. Or the insanity of him trying to work out if he can punch himself into an amnesic state without committing some sort of weird time suicide. It is a little odd that his lab is still set up exactly how Barry needed to recreate the accident, despite him never being there in this timeline. I guess I can ignore that because they could have just had him set things up as needed in a nanosecond anyways. The visual of forcing his molecules through the door eye first is super freaky.
We walked through the door.
Ezra has consistently comical deliveries in this movie that make it fun to watch even when Barry's being annoying. That's a tough balance to strike, and having older Barry react to those annoying tendencies actually makes it much more enjoyable than irritating, while also adding in some important character growth. That was really well handled. The movie then gets like 10,000 brownie points from me for having Barry whisper black speech as he accepts the ring.
Don't kill yourself using your powers.
Then tying things back to the Future, that's an odd line to say, it's such an insanely niche but funny twist that saving Barry's mom somehow resulted in Eric Stoltz never being fired from that film. They spend a weird amount of time on what should have been a throwaway gag, and I wonder what that meant to anyone who doesn't know the behind-the-scenes casting trouble they're talking about. I would have been open to even more random timeline oddities like this, but there really wasn't that much room left to continue riffing off gags of this nature. After they've met up with Bruce and resolved some things, he takes on the role of our resident time travel explainer. As trope-laden as it is, I kind of love when movies bend over backwards to explain their specific time travel rules. It's often easier to just ignore it to nullify potential loopholes caused by over-explaining.
Time travel shit just fries your brain like an egg.
But it's a fun tightrope to watch each new screenwriter walk, and honestly I really dig the spaghetti theory presented here. It's unique, simple, elegant, and quickly explains away all the chaotic nonsense happening, like Batman suddenly being 30 years older.
What does the Parmesan mean? The metaphor's over, it's just a garnish.
And as my editor for this video pointed out, hey Wen, it's hilariously on the nose to have Bruce literally spoon-feeding this info to Barry. This trio rolls out together to save Supergirl, and we see young Barry's overconfidence in his new powers getting the better of him. A bullet ripping through his leg in ultra slow-mo was kind of horrifying. They head back to the Batcave to give Barry a supercharge of yummy sweet lightning goodness. This blast, covering him in a web of lightning scars and blisters, is brutal, but it's a great detail. It's both realistic and underscores that if this doesn't work, he's not walking away from it. With his powers returned, this bizarro Justice League makes their way back to Zod, who's been patiently waiting for their return like a good little alien. I really do think bringing Michael Shannon back was a great idea. He's an intense actor who is fantastic as this ruthless, domineering, cold villain. It works both in the sense that they don't have to establish a new threat and gives him the chance to add more to this character. At least, that's what it should have done. Shannon has pretty openly said that he just cashed a paycheck here and got no creative fulfillment out of returning to the character. And now I can see why. He wasn't really given anything to work with and is more or less wasted in his return as Zod. Relegating him to a plot device, same as Supergirl, meant they left some very obvious opportunities on the table, having them interact and using that to expand both characters. It's a damn shame. As for the actual fighting and action here, it's mostly pretty great. This open landscape is super boring, and CGI is leaned on incredibly heavily again. But here it's actually to their benefit, allowing for some tight, energetic, complex sequences that are allowed to play out without 1,000 quick cuts. I think if they completely rethought the Chrono Bowl, doing away with full digital dummies of everyone in the movie, and reallocated that time and money instead instead onto all the action VFX, this movie would have been far better for it. Because there's some great stuff here, like Barry using his molecule phasing to punch into a Kryptonian's heart. That's sick. Once they realize they're losing, past Barry proposes going back in time. I really wish they attempted to remotely make that an obstacle for them. He got his powers like 2 days ago.
You're not fast enough yet. You sure?
And then boom, he just goes and does it. That's super lame. I do think repeating the battle over and over could have been made much more interesting. I'd look to a movie like Edge of Tomorrow, where Cruz and Blunt flip their way through the battlefield with max style points because they've done it 100 times before, then always dying in some new way they haven't yet seen. An additional segment showing that build-up before the Barrys come to realize this failure is inevitable would have felt much more climactic and unavoidable. Then building to the point where Barry starts phasing into shrapnel, losing gear and stamina on each attempt, insisting on always trying again. That spiral is really well done, and I'm a little torn because having present-time Barry more quickly come to understand the consequences of this time looping is important for his character growth. I just wanted there to be a bit more of a build-up to them starting and performing these loops. The ideas here are solid, but the execution feels rushed. Even with some pretty major misses in this third act, the movie wraps up fairly well. I'm iffy on Barry moving the tomato cans to save his dad.
The tomatoes moved from the bottom shelf to the top shelf and subsequently uncooked the spaghetti.
Because that directly undercuts the lessons he just spent this entire movie learning about altering history. And he immediately sees the ramifications of that yet again. And it falls flat when we know it's not really setting up anything that's actually gonna come after. At the very end here, I actually couldn't tell whose voice that was, so I was half expecting Keaton to walk out of the car, and I never could have anticipated that Clooney cameo.
Who the fuck is this?
What an unbelievably perfect use of their one F-bomb. As pointless as this scene is, I kind of love how they handled the reveal. I hope Clooney made bank for filming those 4 seconds. Even Momoa in the post-credits with his 1 minute of screen time is as likable as ever.
Harry. I live right here. It's okay.
The ending of this movie seemingly implies that Barry now needs to go back in time and send his dad back to jail again. All of that is a bit of a mess, underscored by Ezra's hair and makeup making it crystal clear this was all reshoots, massively pivoting the ending to fit into the new plans for the DCEU. Presumably, they'll just cut ties with this movie through the reboot and never deal with the true ramifications of Barry's further time meddling. Just move on and give us Wally West in the new movies instead, you cowards. The part of the ending that was actually handled well was Barry's relationship with his mother. That has been the heart of this movie, and spending some extra time on it at the end was very important. We see that Barry's mom is actually just the sweetest, most gentle, kind, and caring person possible. We immediately love her as well, and watching Barry attempt to drag out this brief interaction with her is beautiful, touching, and heartbreaking. There are some high highs in this movie, and their relationship is thankfully one of them. They probably should have ended the movie on this emotional high, as Barry tinkering with time yet again and the Clooney cameo undermines the weight of this wonderful scene. And speaking of unnecessary cameos, you may have noticed that I skipped past some pretty major parts of this movie. And while there are loads of cameos, if you cut every single one, you'd only save like 4 minutes of runtime. No Way Home, this is not. These cameos add nothing to the movie, rather than teaching us more about Barry through multiversal reflections of himself, the meaning of destiny, the nature of the multiverse, or anything else that would actually make us invested in this larger world or the threat on hand. These cameos are just shoehorned in and are all given less than a moment's thought each. I'll start with a simple one that happens early on. Wonder Woman shows up. I had no idea she filmed scenes for this, and it started out as a pretty fun surprise to see her, right up until it became apparent how slipshod this inclusion was. Gal cameoing in movies in 2023 has become a bit of a meme, and now in back-to-back DC movies with this and Shazam 2, they handle it the exact same way, playing her awesome hype-building theme before Gal stiffly delivers like 2 lines never to be seen again. They even recycle the lasso of truth gag, having these heroes share more than they intended, which was funny before, but it's already getting kind of old.
Never gets old.
And I really had to roll my eyes that they took the whole Bruce should just give his money to the poor argument so literally. Obviously, Bruce wouldn't view that as a truth, or else he wouldn't be out there fighting crime with his fists. It kinda irks me that this movie gave weight to that critique that's never really held any water. As many before me have pointed out, giving money to the poor doesn't stop shit when an insane clown poisons the city's water supply every other week. But more importantly, it's actually kind of wild how quickly and thoroughly Wonder Woman went from being one of the most exciting new superheroes to being completely devalued across this franchise. Batman v Superman got people excited for her. Her original film felt fresh and fun. Then the sequel was a hot mess. And now, the more this franchise has spiraled the drain, the more her cameos have started to feel like a joke rather than fun connective tissue through this universe. The fact that I was more bothered than excited by a Wonder Woman cameo is exactly why the DCEU is getting rebooted. Even funnier than that is the return of Antje Traua. She was an actual character and a legitimate threat in Man of Steel. Now they brought her back 10 years later to... what? Have her look at the camera a few times? I don't think she even has a line of dialogue here. Why center a movie around traveling back to such a specific point in time, rehiring these actors, only to do nothing with them? It's truly baffling. But now we need to talk about those cameos. The ones my buddy Zach referred to as digital necromancy. And I think that sums up the horror of it quite well. I'm glad to hear Christopher Reeve's family signed off on this. That makes it an overall easier pill to swallow. I'm not sure about most of the others here, especially including George Reeves, which feels like an insult to his memory and legacy. George grew to resent the character after the role killed his ability to land other acting gigs, with many speculating that the resulting frustrations in his life and career directly led to his suicide. We can never know for sure whether he'd be okay with this inclusion, but it feels pretty tasteless to forcibly bring back an actor for a role he publicly resented. Then, out of nowhere, they include the random fan service of Nick Cage from the unproduced Superman Lives? At least he actually filmed scenes for this, and I guess they finally granted John Peters his wish of seeing Cage's Superman fight a gigantic spider? What an oddly niche thing to include. And more importantly, what the hell does any of this have to do with The Flash? They do briefly have Jay Garrick, but the rest of these cameos are tied to secondary characters from this story. Alternate Supermen, Batman, Supergirls. Are you seriously shitting me that you couldn't instead include Grant Gustin here? Maybe John Wesley Shipp, or even Kyle Gallner's Bart Allen from Smallville? Nah, those wouldn't have been nearly buzzworthy enough. Instead, they spend infinite money resurrecting actors who have little to nothing to do with this movie, all for the sake of some clickbait headlines, flinging them around on screen in these ugly-ass universe balls. The movie comes to a hard stop for 2 minutes to pointlessly show us all this. There was a way to make these cameos feel earned or even just interesting, which is a very low bar to clear, and this wasn't remotely it. I guess they should have spent infinity plus $1 to save all this from looking like complete ass. It was just a lazy, blatant cash grab, and not only did it not pay off, but it left me feeling kind of icky and tarnishes the entire movie to a small degree. And with all that out of the way, let's wrap things up, shall we? I found The Flash had this overall cheeky sense of humor that I was really into, striking a solid balance of character-based humor, physical gags, unexpected punchlines, with doubled-up geeky berry banter, while limiting the in-jokes, even though there's still quite a few of them. Based on all the negative press, I thought having Ezra Miller twice would make this movie unwatchable. Instead, I really enjoyed their performance as both Barrys, and found their dynamic as both young and old Barry together to be one of the strongest parts of the film. Because of all the crossover with previous DC movies, it's a lot of fun for anyone who is familiar with that history, but I imagine it makes it entirely inaccessible to anyone looking for a standalone Flash movie. And on the flip side, those references are more often a letdown since they're rarely explored in a way that adds to what came before. The big, boisterous throwbacks are often outshone by the more intimate moments, and it made me question what this movie could have been if they instead focused on simply making a Flash-specific movie. There are some truly exciting, unique, and inspired set pieces that make for some wild and entertaining action. However, the majority of those are hindered by truly abysmal CGI. This was probably the most I've ever liked Batfleck, and I kinda hope he's a good indication of what we're gonna get with Brave and the Bold. And Keaton was an absolute standout. He's just as good as ever. But both Supergirl and Zod felt totally wasted. Are you seeing the pattern here? For almost everything I liked in this movie, there was some egregious frustration that felt so wholly avoidable. And those borderline distasteful cameos at the end really didn't help my final opinion. The directing, concepts, humor, and tone all work incredibly well for me, and I can absolutely understand why Gunn is choosing to keep Muschietti around. Hopefully with a proper schedule of pre-production, filming, and post, The Brave and the Bold can be something really special. I'm already looking forward to doing a fan casting video for that someday. But what we're left with here in this Flash movie is a clustered mess filled with excellent moments that are all anchored by its many shortcomings. With the somewhat fumbled third act, poor use of Zod and Supergirl, and occasionally wonky editing, it's still an otherwise solid superhero flick that could have earned as high as an 8 out of 10 from me. But once we factor in that awful CGI and those needless cameos, I have to drop it down to, let's say, a 6.5? There was something really special buried in this mix, and unfortunately the end result was not worth the long wait and insane expenses involved. I don't think it remotely deserved the level of hate it received, but with the movie acting as a final testament to everything wrong with the DCEU over the years, I'm left feeling more eager than ever to see what Gunn and Safran do with their rebooted universe. And considering how Marvel has been sliding lately, I think starting from 2025, DC Studios may actually overtake Marvel for the first time since these cinematic universes began. I've been playing mad catch-up on my comic book movie and show reviews. They obviously take a while when I make them this in-depth, and I'm left wondering, should I focus on reviewing them chronologically? Or would you all prefer that I review these movies as they come out like this, then sprinkling in reviews for past movies during the downtime between releases? Your thoughts on that would be very helpful for me. And what did you think of The Flash? Are you excited to see everything rebooted? As always, there's so much to talk about, and I greatly enjoy reading your comments on the subject. Thank you all so much for watching, thank you to patrons of the channel for their support, and I hope to see you all again soon.